Hello and welcome to the SITC Biotech Talent Development webinar series. My name is Chris Heery. I'm your moderator for this. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Arcellx. Today's focus is going to be on the paths toward potential involvement in clinical development, and we are very lucky to have three leaders in the field who over the last number of years have led in a variety of different companies. I will let them introduce themselves, first starting with Dr. Elsayed.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Yusri Elsayed. I'm an oncologist and currently is the global head of oncology therapeutic area at Johnson & Johnson.
Dr. Hege.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kristen Hege, formerly head of early clinical development for hematology, oncology, and cell therapy at Bristol Myers Squibb, as well as a clinical professor of medicine at UCSF, currently semi-retired and sitting on 4 to 5 boards.
Dr. Humphrey.
Hi, I'm Rachel Humphrey. I'm the CEO of Normunity and also sitting on a bunch of boards.
Well, great. Thanks for the short introductions. I think we're going to start off by asking each of you to maybe just give us 5 to 10 minutes about your journey, how you got to where you are in your career, and what were the sort of key points that drove some of the decisions that got you to where you are. Well, Dr. Elsayed, we'll start with you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Chris. I'm sure like many others, I was very interested in medicine for all the obvious reasons and went to medical school. And somewhere during medical school, I become more and more interested in research and wanted to learn more about it and participated in that. But to be honest, I didn't know what kind of research I was interested in. So during medical school, then I started thinking of applying for more basic research. So I ended actually doing my PhD after I finished medical school, which is a very long way to do things, but it was very informative and I think that I liked it a lot. But again, towards the end of my PhD, I figured out that actually what I wanted to do is clinical research. So I went back and finished my residency in internal medicine. And during that time where I understood well that, the clinical research I wanted to do is in clinical drug development and new drug development. So I think that helped me a little bit focus of what I needed to do then, and went to NCI and NHLBI where I did my oncology and hematology fellowship. And at that time, I knew where exactly I wanted to go. So I felt that at that time, mostly, successful drug development happens a lot in pharmaceutical companies or biotech. So I wanted to go immediately from my fellowship into a pharma drug development environment. But with the advice of many people, and I felt that it will be more useful, or they advised me that it would be more useful to have some experience in actually being in an academic environment and treating patients and know how IRBs work and how the system works. So I ended up as an assistant professor in New Jersey in Robert Wood Johnson Medical School for several years. And after some times, I thought that I learned as much as I could. So I joined at that time Bristol Myers Squibb for a few years, and then J&J, which I have been here now for almost 20 years. And the journey, of course, take you through multiple aspects of drug development. I work on different groups, mostly in the clinical area, but also managing research from discovery to early research through early clinical development, late clinical development. And I now lead a group who manage these different departments. So that is my story. And I think Dr. Hege can tell us her experience as well, and we can take questions after that.
Great, thank you. It sounds like we all have BMS in common.
Yes.
Anyway, so Kristen Hege, I'm a oncologist by training. I went to med school at UCSF and did my residency at Harvard, Brigham and Women's, and then back to UCSF for my fellowship. This was in the 90s. It was in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. While I was thinking about the research years of my fellowship, I had already appreciated, I really wanted to do something translational, which was kind of a buzzword back in the day, but meaning research that really could be applied to developing treatments for patients with cancer and other serious diseases. So 1 month, my attending at the county hospital was a biotech CEO who was a part-time faculty at UCSF. And after we got to know each other, he asked if I'd be interested in doing my 2 research years of my fellowship at his startup biotech company. And I was looking at labs on campus. It was UCSF. It was all very basic, like cancer genetics, RAS, MYC, what causes cancer. And they were engineering T cells to treat cancer and HIV. So UCSF, to their credit, let me go spend 2 years of the research years of my fellowship in the lab at this biotech company, transducing T cells and stem cells to redirect them to kill cancer and HIV-infected cells. After the 2 years, I went back to UCSF. I figured I was always going to do academic medicine, be a physician scientist, run a lab, see patients, the triple threat, as they say. I started to write my KO8 award. And I honestly had one of those epiphany moments. I joined a new lab. I was sitting in a BL3 lab, like isolating HIV from hematopoietic stem cells. And a technician asked me what I was doing there, given that I had just finished 35 years of education to become a doctor. And I had to ask myself, what am I doing here? And I sort of made the decision, I'd really like to go back to that biotech company and help them file their first IND for the first CAR T cell to go into a human trial sponsored by a company. So I did that, but I talked to both sides and created a hybrid appointment where I was 80% biotech and 20% clinical faculty, but really just on the seeing patients side of clinical faculty, not on trying to run a lab on campus. And so I went off and I was at that biotech company for 16 years. We filed the first INDs for the first CAR T cell trials, first in HIV, then in cancer. We developed genetically modified cancer vaccines, engineered oncolytic viruses, all this stuff that was decidedly unpopular at the time. But then in 2008, one of our phase 3 trials failed. The economy tanked. It was the Great Recession. Our DSMB called us the same day that Lehman Brothers announced bankruptcy and said our trial was going to fail. There was no more money. Banks didn't have any money. There was no more money to be had. We had to shut that company down. So I laid myself and my entire team off. By then I was, on the executive team, I was the head of clinical development. So I left that company after 16 years. I was without a job for the first time in my life. I still had my clinical practice, which I had maintained. And I consulted at a bunch of biotech startups for a few years, and then I joined Celgene to help them build an early clinical development program in kind of the Genentech model, where they called it GRED, Genentech Research and Early Development, where you embodied early clinical development into research instead of into late clinical development to try to get more innovation, more crosstalk between the clinicians and the scientists. For me, that was always the sweet spot. I loved working on the next gen innovative stuff. So I built a clinical group at Celgene from 1 to 75. Was there for 10 years. We, had small molecules, biologics, T-cell engagers, and then I'd say the thing that I was most proud of was rekindling a relationship with our former CSO at that little Bay Area biotech company who is now at Bluebird. They were a lentiviral gene therapy company. We were a blood cancer company at Celgene. We were like, hey, why don't we get together and develop CAR T cells for blood cancers? And that led to the development of the first BCMA CAR T cell product, which went on to become approved and currently known as Abecma, and that was in 2021. And after that, but in the interim, BMS acquired Celgene for their pipeline, so I became an employee of BMS. And in 2023, I decided it was time to retire and pursue another big goal of mine, which was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. So my husband and I did that over 2 summers. 2,650 miles. I wrote about it in Endpoint News if anyone's interested, and now I sit on 4, soon to be 5 biotech boards. I do a lot of work with SITSI. I chair their biotech committee, and I turned my hike into a fundraiser supporting early career women physicians and scientists. So that's my story. Happy to answer questions later.
Right. All of us old friends. So nice to hear.
And
our
I worked
story.
with Rachel way back when I was
That's
at
right.
the Bay Area
And
company.
Yusri too. That's right. It's so great. It's just great. All right. So I'm Rachel Humphrey. I'm the founding CEO of Normunity, which is a startup biotech company developing novel anti-cancer therapies. I've been in the drug industry for over 25 years, which I'll tell you about. My academic training includes a bachelor's from Harvard, an MD from Case Western. My training in internal medicine was at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I trained in oncology at the National Cancer Institute. So in describing my career, I'm going to touch on 3 things that characterize careers in the drug industry. I looked over some of the questions. My goal is to use my journey to answer some of the things that might be at top of mind, although I'm excited to answer questions afterwards too. But those 3 things are the breadth of the opportunities. I've been in large and small pharma. The important differences between the company profiles, large and small pharma, within and across those 2 groups. The importance of networking. I'm going to give you some examples of how that worked for me and how I think about it. And if we have a little bit of time, I'll say a word about the unique aspects of oncology drug development that I think might help you in your journey. So first, let me start using the lens of my career to highlight the breadth of opportunities in drug industry. Working across a range of companies and playing roles in developing and launching cancer drugs definitely prepared me for becoming the CEO of a biotech. That may not be your goal, but at the end of the day, I certainly learned a lot. So I started out in large pharma. I earned my stripes first in cancer drug development at Bayer, where I stayed nearly 7 years, leading, among other things, the development of the first wave of small molecule kinase inhibitors for cancer. Nexavar, one of the first tyrosine kinases for the treatment of cancer, became a blockbuster. Before Nexavar and another drug named Sutent, no one took pills with their coffee in the morning to treat cancer. Everyone had chemo, radiation, or surgery, or nothing. Next, I joined BMS, where I founded the immuno-oncology department. At BMS, I shepherded the in-licensing and development of Yervoy, the first immunotherapy to extend life in any cancer, and the drug that arguably started a big wave of energy in immunotherapy. I led that program at BMS for 8 years, first advocating hard for the in-licensing. It was not easy. Then learning how to build a global team, then guiding that global team through to regulatory approval to a year post-global launch. Before Yervoy, no one thought of the immune system as life-saving. As it turns out, the phrase curative systemic therapy can authentically be used for the first time when talking about immunotherapies, as a lot of you know. At AstraZeneca, I founded the immuno-oncology department as well. Imfinzi is my 3rd baby. So altogether, I spent 16 years at big pharmaceutical companies where I learned the process and tactics of drug development from the position of a cross-functional leader with increasing responsibilities. By the time I left AstraZeneca, I was a senior vice president who had the privilege of seeing how all the pieces fit together at a very senior level. Next, I took my drug development expertise to biotech companies that were advancing innovative cancer drugs. For 9 years, I worked as the chief medical officer in multiple companies, first Mirati, when it was still on the East Coast and called Methelgene, then Cytomix Therapeutics, where I also spent some time on the board, and then Black Diamond Therapeutics, which brought me to Boston. These experiences at biotech companies gave me exposure to building, growing startups, raising money, and pushing into new areas of science. The investor customer in biotech is very different than large pharma governance bodies. They seem the same at first, but you learn quickly that they speak different languages in many ways. Small biotechs gave me the experience of watching other people in charge making the tough decisions. Watching and learning is one of the most important things you can do in any job. Any relevant job, translation, clinical, scientific, etc., will feed into your learnings. So I know there are some questions about the specifics of those things. Just recognize if you're in a place where folks are doing stuff that interests you and you get a chance to watch and learn how other people are doing it, you're winning. Doesn't matter exactly what you're doing. But in any event, this diverse combination of experiences across different companies and working on different cancer drugs definitely prepared me for the role I have today. I've been in this role since 2021. Next, let me describe a little more about these roles and why the experience in different sized companies matters. So as I said, across my years of experience, I worked in large and small companies. There are big differences in how the different segments and sizes of drug companies work, and I want to share some of those observations. Big pharma companies offer a great environment to see how the pieces fit together without worrying about money. You compete with other projects for funding, absolutely. I don't want to dismiss that, and sometimes you don't get what you wish you did, but it's not at all the same as in biotech. In large pharma, you are part of larger departments and teams which offer learning opportunities from a variety of mentors and team members. You gain an understanding of best practices and SOPs in the drug industry. You have an opportunity for promotions and career evolution within a larger organization. I was promoted multiple times in the large pharma where I was, and that helped. You're also, though, in a very large bureaucracy, which for an out-of-the-box thinker like me, I needed to learn patience and to adjust to the word no, which was not always easy, but a very necessary skill. Here's another piece of advice. Knowing yourself and where your talents are best used is probably the most important advice I'll give you all day. If you know yourself, if you really choose to understand your own personal strengths and weaknesses as best as you can, it will frame a context for your work and help you be your own guide as you navigate your career growth. Okay, that's large pharma. Biotech companies. They offer a great job setting to put the learnings from large pharma to practice. That's how it worked for me. And my successes with Nexavar and Yervoy and Imfinzi definitely opened doors, no question. But it is a completely different world in the move from large pharma to biotech. And when I made the transition to small companies and thought this was going to be a walk in the park, I had it completely wrong. By the way, some people, as you heard, start in small companies, and there are advantages to that for sure. I'm just going to tell you about my story. What I've observed is that in small companies, you have more responsibility, you wear many hats, and the organization tends to be less structured than the large pharma. You build new capabilities and take on different types of challenges, as biotech companies are often doing things for the first time. You're also part of an entrepreneurial team. That can be possible in large pharma. They have an entrepreneurial sense, but it is not the same. And that can lead to a level of camaraderie and fun when it goes well that's very unique, very special, although I had fun in all of my jobs. But you're also less sure of stability, which is in one of the questions that came up before the meeting, especially in today's market. The upside of winning is enormous, but funding runways beyond a few years are uncommon. And here's a key piece. You have to be willing to craft your personal narrative to move to the next opportunity at any time. But I want to tell you, and I'm eager to hear from my colleagues as well, I wouldn't worry about this. With every job, you are learning, and the next job will build on the previous. And if you're in biotech, think of yourself as working for the sector, not a specific company. And by the way, in the long years I spent at pharma, I had new bosses all the time. So even the word stability is really a relative word. There's no right or wrong size to companies. There can be great opportunities, great people, and great science to work with at any size company. My career path focused on bringing innovative, first and best-in-class cancer drugs to the clinic and to approvals in companies both large and small. That ultimately led me to be ready to build a company myself. I knew there was more work to be done beyond the current immuno-oncology agents. I wanted to focus on drugs that leveraged the untapped biology at the interface of the tumor and the immune system, and that's what we're doing at Normunity. All right, let me give you a word about networking, because that was important in my career as well. I found the opportunity at Normunity based on people in my network. And I want to touch on this because networking is so important in our industry. Tim Shannon, a partner at Canaan Ventures, who was at the early stages of building Normunity in the seed stage, was an old friend from our Bayer days, which you might recall was my first job. Tim was my first boss. 20 years later, he called me and said, come on, let's do this together. He was building Normunity based on innovation from a lab with Li-Ping Chen at Yale. And Li-Ping is an amazing luminary in cancer immunology that I first met at BMS, and we stayed in close touch ever since. So networking is a big part of career paths in industry. This extends to professional organizations that you get involved in, like SITC. You never know when someone in your network becomes vital to your work activity. For example, some of you may know I'm in the band called the Checkpoints. That includes many people in the cancer community. I can tell you that members of this band are scientific colleagues I bounce ideas off of all the time. And by the way, my Checkpoints gigs have absolutely helped me with fundraising. So remember, even your hobbies can build value for yourself. Please, please don't shortchange the other loves in your life. And this just brings me to my last point I want to touch on, which is the unique aspects of working in oncology drug development. I want to make sure that I can share my learnings before I turn the microphone back to Dr. Heery and my friends. Oncology is the largest therapeutic area of drug development, accounting for up to 45% of the biopharmaceutical industry's $200 billion annual R&D spend. While it's great to have this large scope, it also means that anyone working in oncology drug development, whether you're an investor, an executive considering a partnership deal, or someone looking for a job, it's important to do your homework on the current oncology landscape. And let me just give you 2 examples in my career about how that worked really well. So whether you're starting out in the middle of building your career or you're already, whether you're starting out or in the middle of building your career, it's important to look for oncology companies and drug programs that have the potential to meaningfully raise the bar beyond the current standard of care, not just offer incremental benefits. Lots of companies have been closing, partly because they weren't necessarily aiming high. While there's no doubt that unmet needs remain in cancer, the magnitude of those needs and the competitive landscape of new drugs are very different across different kinds of cancers. And at Normunity, we've always been focused on untapped mechanisms that bring new approaches to potentially transform treatment for cancer patients. But my second point is an important one. Remember, the novelty of new approaches can come with greater uncertainty, longer timelines, and an unclear roadmap for development plans. These days, especially, investors and pharma partners often require certain levels of de-risking for the projects they want to get involved in. So at Normunity, we encountered an active issue with our lead program at Normunity. Rather than pursuing promising targets that would require simply longer timelines in preclinical validation, we actually balanced what we knew about the market and what we saw in the transformational opportunity in a clever way that made our lead program very high value. And as some of you may know, we just closed a $75 million financing in January. Here's how we did it. And I want you guys to pay attention to that as you're thinking through companies you might work for, companies you're working for now. We had a novel target. We had de-risking information about that novel target because there's a foundation of literature about the target, and we were able to do some mechanistic studies. But we fit into the current trends for T-cell engagers. We used clinically validated settings for our constructs. We had significant upside for the target because it's expressed on multiple tumor types, can be leveraged in multiple biological modalities, including ADCs and radiotherapies. But the bottom line is we took something novel, but we built it in a format of something familiar. I'm happy to answer questions about it, but the bottom line is pay attention to what the companies are doing and how they're doing it. Make sure you understand where the value is added, where the risks are reduced, and where the opportunity exists. Just summarizing. If I had to do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing. By the way, to answer one of the questions that came beforehand, I would not stay in academics. I loved the NCI, but as it turned out, our industry gave me more tools to do my work than academics ever could. Both large and small pharma taught me things I needed. The jobs that were raging successes and the ones that, at least at the time, didn't feel so great were all important for my growth. I was ready to do very well in the CEO seat after more than 20 years watching other leaders make choices I definitely seek to emulate to this day, and other leaders making choices that I learned the hard way to avoid. I spent my career in pattern recognition. I also sought to know myself very well, and I believe, although there's still so much learning, always, you never stop learning, I believe I know now who I can trust to be by my side and who I can't. Anyway, that's it. I turn it back to you guys. Oncology is super exciting. So much opportunity to grow.
Thank you all for those incredible stories of your careers. I think there are tons of little lessons in there, and maybe I can just start with one that I think we see coming up through a number of the questions that have been submitted ahead of time, and even one that is now in the Q&A. And that is, are there not just skills, but are there attributes of individuals that you think tend to result in that person being more likely to achieve more of a leadership role in whether it's biotech or pharma? If they're different, that's helpful. But if you think that there are a core set of performance attributes that tend to distinguish people, could you share those? And maybe Dr. Elsayed, you could start.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, over the last many years, I think probably you could hear from all of us is that, you know, working in drug development in big or small companies is a very, very difficult thing. You know, still until this day, there's probably 1 out of 10 or out of 15 drugs that makes it. So failures are more common than successes. So I think what we look for, or what I look for, is really people who are very passionate about making a difference. You know, they know there is unmet need out there. They know that they want to alter patient life and provide something that is definitely currently not available, and understanding that there's going to be failures. And that is most of the time is far more important than the technical skill. You can teach people a lot of technical skills, but you need that motivation, you need that passion and the drive for it. And also what I look for is also, you know, most people who come into drug development come through, you know, either PhDs, MDs, and or postdoc. So there is that give you the confidence in the technical aspect of like understanding data, able to interpret data, able to rigorously ask questions and trying to find the answer to them. But that motivation and the passion to change patient life is what I look for. And can tell you, we have over the years, between all the companies I work for, they provide a lot of opportunities for technical knowledge and expertise that will come, but you need that motivation to succeed.
Dr. Hege, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I agree with that. I guess my opening comment would, on a team, you want a diversity of skill sets and talents. And, you know, if you end up in industry, you'll do a lot of these personality, you know, metrics around teamwork, and realize that the highest functioning teams are those that have the most diverse mix of talents. So there is no one single talent that is going to set you up for success. Everybody's unique, and you want to play off your strengths. I think one thing you learn when you become a leader of people is you want to amplify people's strengths as opposed to, you know, point out their weaknesses all the time. That's not motivating. What's motivating is help them build their strengths. We're not all going to be good at everything. That said, you know, there are certain strengths that, you know, resonate with me, and I agree that passion is important. Curiosity is important. Being a team player is important. Having appropriate humility. What we do is incredibly hard. I spent my whole career in early drug development where 90% of things fail. That builds, I think, a really important humility that guides you when you're trying to learn from those failures and just be a little bit smarter the next time, but never have the hubris that you know how it's all going to work out. And being optimistic, because you do face a lot of failure, and willing to change because you pivot a lot. So I guess those are my comments. Build off your strengths. There is no one unique leader.
Totally agree. there's so many things there I couldn't say better myself. I want to emphasize a handful of things. I think curiosity and humility and optimism are vital pieces, along with all the other things that Kristen and Yusri said. What I would say, though, is it's very important as you face any organization in any role to understand the context in which you're living. And it's important that you recognize that in an academic setting, you're moving the science along for the sake of the questions. In an industry setting, whether it's large pharma or small pharma, there is a larger context in which you're working. That means that in your academic learning, you might have learned to do things or to move in a certain direction for a certain reason. You need to have your ear tuned to the context. And that context may change from company to company because there are different individual goals. It may change depending on the culture. But I think one of the most important common features that a good leader has is a willingness to listen to why they're asking the question, when they're asking the question. And if something goes wrong, being ready to own what we could have done differently and in the context of where you are, moving to find solutions.
Yeah. Those are, I think, all very practical responses for those that are tuned in. We notice that the mix of attendees here is about not quite 50-50 academic, and then maybe about 35% or so people who are already in industry. And some of those are people who may not have medical degrees who are thinking about trying to get into clinical development. Do you all have any? I know, Dr. Hege, you already answered on the chat there, but maybe you all could just comment on what some successful paths might look like for non-medical people in the clinical development world. Maybe we can go in the reverse order this time.
Yeah, so you don't have to have a degree. You don't need an MD. You don't need a PhD to contribute. Those help for some paths, but they're not critical for others. Program management can take you to leaderships up to chief operating officer, even chief executive officer without a degree. I know at least one really wonderful CEO of a small biotech who came through clinical operations. So if you have a PhD and not an MD, clinical scientist roles, medical scientist liaison roles, which offers you an opportunity to build relationships with various constituents inside and outside the company, are also important opportunities. The fact on the ground is that the pharmaceutical industry, both biotech and large pharma, require, as Kristen said, a diversity of skill sets, a complex array of teams that all contribute. I don't know, Kristen, if you want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think a great place to transition, especially in a larger pharma company, from a sort of a discovery research role into a clinical development role is early clinical development. Companies organize themselves in different ways. Sometimes they embed early clinical development with research. That makes those transitions easier because you're sort of all part of the same team. Sometimes early clinical development is embedded with clinical development, sort of from IND to approval. Either way, that early space is where all the innovative things from discovery are coming in and going into human trials for the first time, where you're developing novel biomarkers, where it's heavily embedded with the science. So we had a lot of PhD scientists who would be working on the discovery programs that moved into the clinical trial, realized they were really passionate about actually the clinical development, engaging with the patients, engaging with the investigators. And they would often transition into these clinical scientist roles, which was separate from clinical operations and was more scientific. You helped build the protocols, the biomarker plans. You collected and analyzed all that data. There were novel analytics. You worked with your data science colleagues, with your biomarker colleagues, with your discovery colleagues. So I think clinical science is a great place for PhDs. There's also a lot of other functions in a drug development team that are relevant for scientists that kind of want to move out of discovery and into development: regulatory affairs, clinical operations, project management, project leadership, as Rachel said, business development. You do a lot of vetting of potential partnerships, especially in the early development space. So you have to dive in and do diligence on all the science and what is the development path and is there an unmet need and what's competition. That's often can be a business development role. So a lot of PhDs will transition into business development. So I'd say there's a lot of opportunity to leverage what you may have thought was going to start out as a bench science career into a broader sort of R&D remit, and you can move around amongst those different functions.
Yeah, and in big companies like Johnson & Johnson, I think we have seen that a lot. I see it a lot. I think one of the things that both Kristen and Rachel mentioned, drug development is a team sport. So you ultimately need a team, and that's how it usually works. And you need different expertise and different backgrounds. And in our group, we have one environment or one therapeutic area, essentially from the discovery research to translational and to early development, late development, even medical affairs is in one unit. And over time, you see people moving around. Some people from like very research discovery background, they wanted to have experience in clinical or in other aspect, and over time, most companies has become receptive to that. They make it easier for you to go to another job or spend 6 months in a kind of a grow role to see if that's really what you are looking for or no. But there's, as Kristen just listed them, a lot of different roles in clinical development that are non-MDs. One role that I remember, I don't know, Rachel, if you had a similar role, at J&J, we call it compound development lead, which essentially end up being like the champion that used to be at BMS. It's like the CEO of a specific drug. These roles are the individual who's running the whole team for any specific drug. And like 100% of them are non-MDs in our organization. So you can see the influence and the seniority of the person who's running that role is very critical.
That's super helpful. Thank you all for that. And maybe we can flip that question almost 180 degrees for people who have been on the medical side, taking care of patients, maybe have participated in clinical trials, maybe not been PI, but maybe they've been PI on a study or two. What does it look like and feel like being an MD or an advanced practitioner and then going into industry? What are the differences that you don't know about? What are the things you have to pick up on? And where's the fish out of water moment that people might feel?
Let me start with this one just because I have a funny story and I'd be so interested to hear other folks. When I joined Bayer in 1997, when I was 15, of course, the first time I was there a week, I was the only oncologist, by the way. The oncology organization there was really small. So they decided to do an ad board with other physicians. And those of you who know me will not be surprised that I raised my hand and said, wait a minute, you just hired me. Don't you want to know what I think? I mean, and a very, very kind person said, what you think matters, don't get me wrong, but in fact, the way that medicine is handled in different parts of the country of the United States, as well as different parts of the world, even different types of practices, is something you couldn't possibly know. And that in fact, there's a lot you don't know. And that was my first week and my first test of humility, which of course has been, as Kristen noted before, humility is one of the things you have to pick up from minute one. It turns out that what you learned is important outside of the pharma industry, but there is so much more you don't know that you become part, even the MD, who on the outside is in charge of a lot of very important decisions, becomes one of many voices in a larger team. And if you can do that humbly and thoughtfully, you'll do just fine. I don't know if others have stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna. Oh, go ahead, Yusri.
Yeah, I think that is really what resonated with me as well. Because if you come from a patient treating environment where you have a lot of responsibilities, but you have a lot of authority in decision making, and you write an order, somebody will give the medication or do that. I think that is the biggest change that you have to kind of consciously know and try to change when you come into farm. Then you become part of a team of a lot of very highly skilled and also knowledgeable people. There's a lot of PhDs in your team, people who probably know about the target more than you will ever know, people they will have experience running operation more than you will ever know. But they still need you. You are like the one who knows how much medical needs, you know what the patient needs. But you have to be able to kind of work in a team, an environment, and where everyone else, their expertise come together to take that project forward. I think that is the largest shift I have to make. And at the beginning, it wasn't easy because you kind of you are accustomed to just run, make decision, and keep moving. Now you have to remind yourself, I have a team that I have to go back to and work with them. Kristen, sorry, I jumped into this before you spoke.
I just had one comment. I have a slide in one of my decks that I give. When you come to a fork in the road, take both. You do not necessarily need to pick between your clinical practice, academic clinical practice career, and an industry career. I transitioned early, right during my fellowship, and I maintained a hybrid career path for 30 years. So I had a clinical faculty appointment. I saw patients every week. I attended on the inpatient service. That was a great way to recruit talent, I might add. And I, had a full-on biotech career up to executive roles. For me, I never wanted to give up the practice of medicine. I loved seeing patients and, spending 30 years practicing medicine. You went through the evolution of medical practice with your academic colleagues. You were more able to relate to your academic investigators because you lived in their world part-time. And I can tell you, when COVID hit, having a clinic in the middle of COVID and dealing with everything that the hospitals and clinics were doing to manage COVID and going to telemed overnight, on Zoom that, interfered with your BMS Zoom. And I mean, that was an experience that was just unbelievably relevant, I'd say, for the company as we were all learning about COVID in real time. So for those of you who are physicians and you've been in academic medicine or you've been in practice, and now you're thinking maybe an industry career, but you're not sure you want to give up, clinical care altogether, you don't necessarily have to. There are lots of opportunities. It maybe isn't going to be UCSF and industry. It might be some other opportunity to practice, but I can tell you almost everybody I hired during my industry career, we worked with them so that they could maintain a clinical footprint if it was important to them. And that
I did
kind of
too.
became our brand.
That's right. And I did too. I was an attending at a Yale affiliated hospital for most of my career until I left Connecticut. And then purposefully didn't continue it because I made choices about the hours I put in. But there was no question that I was always supported by the companies to do that.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe just pull out one of those points on, someone coming in as, for instance, a medical director, I think is probably what some of these questions are focused on. And I think it may not be as obvious that your medical knowledge and your ability to manage patients isn't necessarily the only thing you need to be able to do that role, right? There's things about how a study gets activated, management of an IRB, amendment processing, and just knowing who to talk to within that academic institution, data cleaning, talking to the other component parts of clinical development. All of those things are actually really difficult to learn outside of industry, other than if you've been the PI of a lot of clinical trials at an institution. Maybe you'll see some of that. But I do think that's an important point for people to know. There's really no experience that's going to give you quite the same thing as being in industry for true medical director type roles. They're not just, are you a great doctor? In fact, that's probably a relatively small component part of that job. So I just want to highlight that because we do see that question popping up quite a bit.
I think it's really important to emphasize it's not even a great doctor is gonna find a place, but a great pharmacy doctor is a special skill.
Mm.
You can say, I see thrombocytopenia with this drug, but you have to be able to say, and here's why it might be important. You have to go to the literature and understand how the target is related to the platelets. You may be discovering something nobody knows. And that's why even clinicians in pharma need to be curious, thoughtful scientists, because we are, after all, doing clinical science.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
just give one counter perspective. The sort of dogma in industry is that you need industry experience. And if you're an MD and you want a director or senior director role, you need the requisite years of clinical experience. I sometimes think you need to challenge dogma. So for example, when I was leading the pivotal registration trial for Beckman, I needed my junior medical monitor to run that trial. I hired an MD PhD right out of their fellowship program at UCSF to lead that pivotal trial. And everybody told me I was crazy. You can't put a de novo physician new to industry on such an important trial. And my response was, I need a really good doctor. You know, patients getting CAR T cells get really sick. Myeloma docs have never used CAR T cells before. I need someone who's recently been on call in the ICU, on the phone with these doctors 24/7 managing these patients. And that is exactly what we needed. And it worked out incredibly well. And, you know, it took maybe 6 months for the industry to kind of appreciate that skill set really mattered. So I think it's all important, and all of those medical clinical skills that you bring to the table are really important. And part of why I kept my clinical practice going was so that I was able to maintain those clinical skills and that clinical judgment and the perspective of being sort of frontline with the patient, which
It's
you
very
do
important to
risk
understand.
losing in industry if you too far removed from patient care.
I want to make sure everyone understands how to use Kristen's answer right now, because she actually gave you a tool that I want to be clear about. With the challenges in academics that are happening now and the efflux of strong academic physicians into industry jobs that may be uncommon, new academics will be competing with experienced clinical people. But what Kristen just gave you is a narrative to use about yourself, to say, here's what I can give that an experienced person may not be able to give. Because at the end of the day, except for those physicians in industry who continue to practice medicine, there is absolutely a loss of skill set that a freshly, someone who's just left clinical care has in hand, especially with some of the therapies out there. Use what Kristen just said to write your own narrative and to make sure that the strengths that you bring to the table are clear to any hiring manager.
Yeah, and I just want to also say, and don't be scared. You know, if you felt that like Kristen, like a very critical study is going to be, you know, scary, I don't think that should be the case either, because, you know, she's probably had the plan to support that individual, all the drugs, all clinical trials, you know, there's teams, and you will have all the support to do your job well and to learn from it as well.
Is that true in smaller companies?
Can be.
You know, when I joined my first biotech company right out of my fellowship, you know, I had zero experience and I was the only physician in the clinical group, you know, for the first human IND. So yes, I think there is no one path. That's another important. You know, Rachel, you started in big pharma and you took those skill sets to biotech. I started in startup biotech, ended up in big biotech, got bought by big pharma, retired from big pharma. You can go and then circled right back to biotech for my board roles. You know, all those paths are possible. You learn different skills in the different sized industry, and they're all relevant skills.
I think it may be harder now. It may be worth just
Maybe.
noting that when the three of us started, it wasn't as common. And so it was a bit more of an employees market. Now the importance of your narrative is important. Pay attention, because even small biotechs that have multiple physicians will surely need a doctor, a real doctor, in their on their team. And I agree with what Yusri said. Make sure you find an advocate for you, who's going to understand completely what you bring to the table, and be there for you when you get there.
That's great. What this question seems to be coming up a fair amount about being a little too far removed from the science. So if someone was in a more scientific academic role and then went in as a medical director, how can they maintain that relationship to some of those translational elements? Do you have any advice or recommendations about how someone can either diligence that question before taking a role, or move more toward the science if they're in maybe a more straightforward clinical development function?
Well,
I'm not sure I understand the question completely well, so I'm going to answer what I think you're asking, and then you'll
Sure.
correct me.
Yeah.
I think each of us draws out what we think the perfect job will be. I would set that narrative aside right now, because at the end of the day, even the job you think you're getting is not the job you'll have. And that each organization that you're in will have different needs for you. Do the best you can to identify an environment that where everybody has a voice at the table around the science, where you can have advocates within the organization that help you stay in touch with those things. But if you're just entering the space, there's so much to learn. I would be open-minded about how you and your skill sets can help, and recognize that you're in for the long game, and that you'll be drawing out what your perfect job looks like in real time iteratively, and do the best you can to keep looking for it. I hope that answered the question. I don't know.
No, I think that is right on track of what the question was. There's, there are a couple of questions in the chat about, being a medical director or being in what feels like a bit of a pigeonhole within the company. And I think that suggestion to just look for the opportunities to use what when the opportunity arises is probably I mean, I think that's true across any company, whether it's biotech, pharma, anything else, is when you have your chance, take your opportunities to show what you know. Great. Well, so there are some questions around some really specific things about, things like visas and being, a non-US MD. I think for the purpose of this, I'm probably going to skip over that a bit, because those questions are often very company specific in what they can support. But I think some of the summary I've heard, at least, is people who come in with a good skill set and are willing to learn and listen and be humble are probably going to get opportunities to grow, no matter where they trained or any of that. I want to move on to a topic that we heard about leading into this webinar series, which was the work-life balance topic. And I wanted to give you each an opportunity to just sort of address, compared to your colleagues and friends who work in the academic world, or compared to your time in the academic world, how was the difference in work-life balance, and what are some comments you can give on that for the audience?
I'll start with this one, since this was my favorite topic. I'm a huge believer in work-life balance. I've really tried hard in my career to incorporate a lot of downtime. I guess you'd say I'm an adventure athlete, so we do a lot of things like heli skiing and long distance backpacking and backcountry skiing, etc. One of the things I did as a leader, obviously at the end of my group, is to try to normalize that mindset as part of the culture for my team. So I took off the grid vacations. I was never reachable on my vacations. And I put that in my out of office message, like, I'm heli skiing in the Canadian Rockies. I will not be reachable for a week. Call my assistants to get further direction. And because I did that, everybody on my team then felt comfortable that they could really check out on their own vacations. They could not check their emails all morning and agree to 2 Zoom calls in the afternoon. So I think you have to practice what you preach, they say. And, when you're looking at a role, you might look at your boss. Does that person practice what they preach? Do they really believe in balance? And then try to establish it for you and your team as you become a leader of people. I do think the balance is incredibly important. I retired at the peak of my career to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. People thought that was kind of an unusual move, but it was important to me. So whatever it is, if it's singing and drama, I don't know what yours is, Yusri, for me, it's sort of outdoor adventure. Value it the same way that you value your career. And then accept that, it all takes time, and you do have to be efficient with time management if you are going to value those things in your career that give you balance.
And I think that is true for me as well. Sometimes this work-life balance, I think it become an issue if you see them as two separate things. But if it end up, if you normalize it, as Kristen say, you will handle it very well. I think my work-life balance in the pharmaceutical industry, I can say 1,000 times better than when I was getting a pager every hour when I was covering the floor or covering the emergency room. Is very, very, very different. This doesn't mean that it's not busy. I think, and it depends on a small or larger company or where you are in your career. It is a busy job, but it is a way that you can structure it around your family or your activities around everything. And I think is very much enjoyable than when you don't really have control. And I think that is really what is important. More recently after COVID, and recently also it become, working from home, working from wherever you are, especially in much larger companies, made that also a little bit more easy to do. So I think the work-life balance is definitely much better than you are practicing or in an emergency room or something like that.
So the only thing I would add is it's like any value you have. Work-life balance is a value for some of us more than others. There are all sorts of other lists on your value list: respect, integrity, etc. When you're going in a job, when you're looking for a job, make sure you ask the other people, your peer group, and others, what the value system is and how valued work-life balance is, how value respect. Make your whole list of values, not just work-life balance. But the other piece that I just want to emphasize from my introductory remarks before is you would be amazed at how those who manage work-life balance are iterating work-life in a way that's actually very productive. In addition to the checkpoints, I also directed and produced community theater for most of my career when I was in Connecticut. And I found that leading and directing community theater while leading and directing clinical programs so overlapped that even though one was with kids and adults and the other was with professionals, the learnings from both were very, very important. And so do not believe for a moment that stopping work for a while to hike the trail isn't giving you something remarkably valuable that we know, because we're so crazy about Kristen, she brings back to the world. So be yourself. Make sure you support your values, whatever they are, and don't be afraid to do that because they will serve your career. I'm certain of it.
That's a fantastic place to end. Thank you all so much for these really insightful answers to these questions that have been coming in and sharing your stories with everybody. I'd like to remind everybody that there will be another panel discussion that will focus more on the research and development side on March 27th, and we will have Dr. Dmitry Gabrilovich, Kristen Hege, and Ira Melman on that call. So if you can join that one and you have questions around sort of the discovery side of things a bit more, that will be another very insightful panel. So thank you all again for joining us and for sharing so much of your careers and your insights with us.